Let me, to address the audience and to deliver a special keynote address on the upcoming telecom policy, it's my pleasure, it's my privilege to invite up on stage and to come up here to the dais Madam Aruna Sundararajan, Secretary, Department of Telecommunications, Government of India. If I can kindly call you up here, ma'am.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me compliment ET Telecom for organizing this very interesting conference today, because I think as far as the mobile world is concerned, we are at a very, very interesting inflection point. And as we go into the final stages of India's new telecom policy, I think this conference and the kind of insights that it generates will be of great interest to all of us. The organizers did request me to speak about the new telecom policy. So I will try to share with you some aspects of what the policy will seek to address. I'm sure that from the morning you have had several sessions. Many of them would have addressed a lot of the operational and the business side of telecom. I will try and confine myself to the policy aspects, because that is what the organizers, I think, had requested me to do. The first thing that I want to mention is to address the question, why should anybody be really concerned with a new telecom policy? It's the business of government to come up with new policies from time to time. Is there anything particularly significant about a new communications or telecom policy at this point in time? So the first point I want to mention here is that today we have evolved to a point where digital communication networks have become a fundamental enabler for almost all the other activities that are there in an economy and society. And therefore, it is not just one more policy, but really it is a fundamental enabler. And I think that is why there is and there should be a huge amount of interest in the policy. As we all know, today, digital networks are really emerging as the kind of neural networks that power an economy. And therefore, if we have to get the rest of the infrastructure piece right, the rest of the service piece right, then I think we need to ensure that we have the broad digital highways on which growth and development can take place. So clearly, this is central to both India's growth strategy as well as India's development strategy. I'll just give you two indicators to highlight why it's of critical importance. As we all know, in the rest of the world, the normal figure which is used or which is cited as a measure of impact of the digital economy is that a 10% increase in the internet leads to an increase of around 1.3% in the GDP. What is interesting to note is that last year, ICRIER, on the basis of a very detailed study, had observed that for India, this had been upped 3 times. That means that for a broad 10% increase in the internet usage, for us in India, it made a difference of 3.3% to the GDP. which is absolutely huge. And it indicates why the stakes are so high for us in getting our digital policies and frameworks right. The second point is that somewhere last year, we began to see the growth of a huge data explosion in India. For an economy and a sector which was voice-led for more than a decade, suddenly India has catapulted from being the 155th country in terms of mobile data consumption to #1 in the world, where today we consume on the mobile more data per capita than the US and China combined. And I was just looking at the comparative costs of data, and I'm sure that you would have noticed that today the cost of 1 GB of data has fallen to as low as 4 cents. And a lot of people, I'm just coming back from the World Summit on Information Societies, which was held in Geneva. Most countries offer a 1 GB plan per month, 2 GB plan per month, a 4 GB plan per month. In India today, we have a situation where telcos are, all of them actually offering 1 GB per day. And this might seem counterintuitive because a lot of people ask, is data consumption really such an important indicator? Or are people just consuming entertainment on the internet? I'll share with you a fundamental insight given by one of the leading academicians from Carnegie Mellon. And he said that the amount of bandwidth per capita that a person requires is actually inversely related to his level of literacy. So he said, I'm a professor in Carnegie Mellon, and I probably need 100 KB of data. But somebody who is much less educated than me would require 2 MB. And for somebody who is absolutely not educated, you might require 10 MB of data for them to have the same level of understanding. And that is why for a country like India, we do need to have more bandwidth and more data capacity rather than less. The other reason why this policy is coming at a time when we are at the cusp of a paradigm change is that all of you, I'm sure, would have read what Thomas Friedman says, that in 2007, he says, social media, Apple, the cloud, all of this started coming together. And that is how we started going into a new paradigm. And this was later picked up, and we now speak about Industry 4.0 or the fourth industrial revolution. But what really makes this paradigm change so imminent is the advent of 5G, because 5G is what threads all of this together and makes it possible for us to actually see a massive convergence of these technologies, which is what is going to drive a paradigm change. So what are the strategic policy imperatives that India faces at this time? Because these are the policy imperatives that will shape the policy. The first, as I mentioned, is the policy imperative to provide universal broadband access. And by broadband, we intend to move away from the 512 kbps, which is what we had earlier. The world has moved far ahead, and it is time for India also to set down its aspiration, which we will do in the new policy. We also have a small number of people who still do not have access to the mobile. So both, given that the mobile is the instrument of empowerment and the fact that broadband is what will deliver our services, we will put forward a vision as well as concrete measures to ensure that we have ubiquitous connectivity, universal connectivity in the country. And we intend to define both a set of intermediate objectives as well as the performance objectives that we will achieve in 3 years, in 5 years, and so on. The second important policy imperative is how do we catalyze innovation and investments. If we want to harness the new technologies, many of them were discussed in the earlier panel discussion, we estimate that we will require an investment of not less than 10 to 15 billion USD per year. Now, if this investment has to come in, industry has to have a reasonable rate of return. Merely having a large market will not be enough. We need to see this translated into actual demand. And therefore, the policy will be looking at what needs to be done to spur this order of investments so that we can trigger innovation. This is required both for creating jobs for the economy, but also the new generation of services, the 5G use cases that we often speak about. All of this will require that we quickly upgrade our networks from 2G, because we still have some amount of 2G, to 4G, and then move on to 5G. The next imperative would be to spur entrepreneurship and to ensure that telecom is not merely designed in India because this is an area where today almost all global houses have design centers in India. We then moved up to make in India, but we also now need to look at how we can develop in India and what are the partnerships that will require to be put in place, what are the enablers that will require to be put in place for develop in India will be a key building block of the policy. One key aspect, and this is something that I'm sure is on the top of everyone's mind, is digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty is a term that has acquired huge resonance. Almost overnight, we have all become aware of how our digital sovereignty is being challenged. So this digital sovereignty will mean not merely that individuals are owners of their own data, but also that they have effective autonomy, control, choice, integrity, and security. But along with citizens, we believe it is important that enterprises also have similar safeguards for their data. And at a national level, there are questions and challenges that each country faces in order to ensure that its data is controlled, it has effective control over its data and its security. And the last strategic policy imperative will be for India to position itself as a digital leader, leveraging its two strengths, one in the software sector, and secondly, in terms of its telecom sector, its telecom capabilities. And what we envisage by this is that India will not merely be one of the first recipients of new technologies, but that it will start contributing to many of the new technologies, the new use cases, as well as the new content and services that will ride on these platforms. All of this will, of course, have to be translated into operational objectives, into strategies, into programs and initiatives, and we intend to do that in the policy. Some of the key things that the policy will be looking at is how do we ensure that telecom is recognized as a critical infrastructure and has access to the same level of funding and protection as other critical infrastructure sectors. So we need investment, we need ease of doing business in this area. Many people have already spoken about the necessity for fiberizing India's networks. Rights of way is a critical piece in this, so we will be addressing that in the policy. Spectrum availability, efficiency, as well as affordable prices at which industry can access spectrum, that is an aspect which will be addressed. Simplification of licensing. How do we also look at not merely fiber and towers, but also looking at how we can reform the Satcom policy in the country, how we can ensure convergence between cable and other forms of broadband. So all these will be looked at. We have already received a number of progressive recommendations from the TRI in recent months. Before the policy, we will be concluding our evaluations of these, and many of the suggestions will, we hope, find place in the new policy. The policy will also be built on certain principles which have already been affirmed at various fora and various points in time. As I mentioned, network neutrality, data sovereignty, convergence, transparency. We are putting in a whole piece on how to make sure that the DoT itself is more transparent and more focused towards ease of doing business. I just want to end with this point that this policy, since it has so much riding on it, I would urge that this should be looked at as not merely a policy of the DoT. It is far more than that. It is a policy for the entire central government, but also the state governments, because ultimately the citizens who will use these services and benefit from these services, lie in the deep in the heartland of India's villages, small municipalities, etc. So we hope that this policy will be viewed as a national mission for putting in place the next generation networks. So we will be also building in the institutional mechanisms in the policy to ensure that the state, the center, and local bodies are on the same page and that we work together. Without that kind of working together, I don't think we can achieve the pace of fiberization or the pace of tower densification, etc., that we hope. The second piece where we need to work together is for all the segments of the telecom industry to come together. So whether it is the manufacturers of the handsets or the telecom equipment manufacturers or the telecom service providers, all of us need to work together to make sure that we all are aligned in our vision and actions. And thirdly, the rest of industry, because as we noted, the new paradigm and the new era that is dawning on us is that while we have the neural networks, the arms and legs, the various sectors of industry, whether it is the healthcare industry, automation, industrial automation, consumer automation, whatever it be, all of them will have to come together to make sure that we do create, that this policy is not merely a policy, but that it results in catalyzing the next generation of services and information flows that befit India's aspirations of the 1.3 billion people in this country. With these few words, let me once again thank ET Telecom and all of you for being here and for this opportunity to have this interaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for talking about the policy imperatives of universal broadband access, innovation, as well as entrepreneurship. To conduct a brief Q&A session, could I call back on stage Gulveen Aulak, special correspondent at the Economic Times. Gulveen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ma'am, for joining us here today. A special thank you is in order because we know that you've just landed from Geneva this morning. So again, thanks a lot. Ma'am, you've mentioned a number of points in your speech, and most important of them all, I feel, is the talk about spectrum availability and spectrum pricing. Can you share with, there are a lot of stakeholders here as well, on can there be affordability factor? Can the affordability factor be looked at more deeply in terms of spectrum pricing in the new telecom policy?
See, what I mentioned here are certain broad principles. And now, based on those principles, we will have to work out and see how to actually embed these principles at the level of, the operational requirements. But as you know, already TRAI has given us some progressive recommendations, including on spectrum, on what are some of the new bands that need to be opened up, on what are some of the new bands that need to be de-licensed, etc. So I think, directionally, we are on the same page, and we do expect that once the policy statement comes out, the idea is to make sure that adequate spectrum is available at the right price for people who want to deliver services.
Ma'am, what about new spectrum bands, as you've mentioned right now? Because there's a lot of talk of 5G happening. India now is at a position where it does not want to miss the bus. However, we are still a year or more behind China in terms of spectrum auctions, in terms of networks, in terms of devices. So are we still on track, or are we still lagging behind?
No, I think we are very much on track. And I think that, as I said, we are pretty much aligned with global best practices in this area. And our discussions with, most of the ecosystem players affirms that, we are absolutely, in sync with most of the globe on this.
Ma'am, one very important thing that you've mentioned in terms of investments that will be required in the sector, about $10 to $15 billion. And you also mentioned a pain point of the sector about return on investments. I know, again, these are broad contours, but what can the government do at a policy level to not ensure, but then give some kind of a direction to the industry that this is what the return is, what the government is sanguine about?
See, primarily, this is not, as you know, in India, in the telecom market, government has not really taken a stance on what should be the business models, etc. And that is why I think a lot of innovation and disruption has happened. So I think in the current year, a lot of the consolidation that is going on will be completed. And I think at the end of this process of consolidation, we will see, accelerated growth returning. Because, see, growth figures are still extremely robust. We know that data has grown at 500%. We know that voice is growing at 20%. And we still have a long way to go. So I think what will be important is that industry retains its desire to innovate. So they'll have to compete in the market. But what we intend to do is to provide an environment which encourages innovation, which encourages convergence, and which encourages the growth of new business models. So that will be our attempt.
Does that environment, would it also include consideration of the telecom sector as a critical infrastructure provider? You've mentioned that in your speech as well. Can you elaborate a bit more? Because that is one ask of the industry, and I believe the government is also looking in that direction.
Yeah. So telecom is already declared as an infrastructure, but a lot of the benefits that should typically flow to an infrastructure sector in terms of, availability of easy financing, in terms of some of the protections that should be available to them. That is what I think is missing now, and that is what we will try and address.
Ma'am, data security. Data security is something that, as you know, has blown up in the last 24 to 48 hours. Everybody now is concerned about whether his or her data is secure. And more so, the focus now on companies to ensure that security is there. As part of the policy, this is one aspect that I'm sure the government is addressing. What are the key points that you would want the industry to look at very sincerely? Because these seem to be becoming trickier times as far as data is concerned.
So I think already several pieces of work are underway. As you know, the data protection, the legislation under Justice Sri Krishna, that is a work in progress. That will, drawing from the Putteswamy judgment, it will indicate what are the principles that will be kept in mind so that data protection for the individual is assured. But along with that, we are already looking at, in the telecom sphere, whether there is any further strengthening that needs to be done of the license provisions and so on to ensure that, data is indeed protected. So I think all of these will, basically provide the scaffolding for India's data protection architecture.
Right. We'll take one question from the audience. Sure. Can you go do that? Can you get a mic?
Ma'am, I wanted to ask one question. So in view of the Vision 2022, apart from the new technology, what would be government expectation on the role of an equipment vendor? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, because that's a very important question.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, although in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a big jump in the manufacturing of mobile handsets locally, and I must acknowledge the contribution and leadership that our Honorable Minister IT has provided in this area. He has been a big champion of this, and so we have seen that from zero, we've gone to more than 113 mobile manufacturing facilities being set up in the country. So the next effort would be to make sure that telecom equipment is, one, made in India, but not merely made in India, designed in India and developed in India. And I don't think this is a non-achievable goal, because we have seen that already Indian companies have huge capabilities in this area. We have made pioneering contributions, for example, in the 3GPP standards for 5G. And our academic institutions have also come up with a clutch of new innovations. So I think this is an area where we will increasingly be focusing on. So we want both non-domestic companies to come in and manufacture telecom equipments in India, but we also want homegrown innovation. And I'll tell you why this is important. This is important because wherever we have had homegrown innovation, we have been able to do it extremely frugally. The Aadhaar is a prime example of frugal innovation. But similarly, For example, in the BharatNet, we made the GPON locally. That is also an example of a very frugal and cost-effective innovation. So we want to see make in India, we want to see design in India, and we want to see develop in India.
Great. Thank you very, very much, ma'am, for all your time here.